What's up everyone, it's the Law School Lumberjack. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to be doing another installment of our LSAT tip series, and today we're going to be looking at some logical reasoning questions, specifically necessary assumption questions. In a companion video, we'll be going through sufficient assumption questions, so when the sufficient assumption video is done, I will link that in the description bar below. Also, I'd recommend that you look at my previous videos regarding answering the standard logical reasoning questions so that you can really hone in on the best steps to answering your stereotypical logical reasoning questions. I will also link that in the video description below. Please check it out. So one of the major question types in your logical reasoning section is going to be the necessary assumption questions. Now, an assumption is basically an unstated premise in your argument. So oftentimes what you'll have is you'll have some written support or some explicit support, a conclusion, but then there's going to be some sort of gap or something missing, and that's usually some sort of unstated assumption that's required to make your argument work. Now, one of the major things that trip people up when answering an assumption question is firstly what a necessary assumption is versus a sufficient assumption, and then also what the question stem is asking. For example, is the question stem asking me to find a necessary assumption, or is it asking me to find a sufficient assumption? So let's get started on what a necessary assumption is. So a necessary assumption is something that is required for the argument to be correct. Put another way, if the necessary assumption is wrong, or if we negate the necessary assumption, your conclusion and the argument will not be able to stand. So to clarify this for my students, what I always do is I analogize to a baking soda and vinegar volcano. If you remember as a little kid, you poured the baking soda and vinegar together and you got an explosion. Now, each of the baking soda and vinegar are necessary for the explosion. If you took either one or both of them away, you wouldn't have the chemical reaction. So they are in and of themselves necessary because they're required to make the explosion happen. However, neither on its own is sufficient. In order to get the chemical reaction, you actually have to combine both of them. So if, for example, I just put baking soda into a container and left it, the reaction wouldn't happen. And if I just put vinegar into a container and left it, the reaction wouldn't happen. So both the vinegar and baking soda obviously are required, are necessary, but each of them in and of themselves are not sufficient. Now, in this video, as I said, we're only going to be focusing on necessary assumption questions. So I'm sure a lot of you have done some questions and seen a logical reasoning question which deals with assumptions. So you may be wondering, okay, if I'm reading the question stem, how do I know if the LSAT writers are asking me to look for a necessary assumption versus a sufficient assumption question? Words that denote a necessary assumption question are words such as depends, relies, requires, and enables. So a question stem hinting that the writers are looking for a necessary assumption would be something like, which of the following assumptions is one that's required by the argument? Or which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? So there's many different ways to approach a necessary assumption question. One of the main ways that you've probably heard of is the negation method. So how the negation method works is you take all of the possible answer choices and negate them. You then apply the negated assumptions to the argument and see which one breaks the argument, or in other words, which one, when applied to the argument, prevents the conclusion from being possible. The one that prevents the conclusion from being possible when negated is your necessary assumption. Now that is a very good, very accurate method. The problem with doing that is it takes a lot of time. So I recommend you use the negation method as a last resort because you don't always have the time to negate all the possible answer choices. Alternatively, if you think you have the right answer, another option is to use the negation method as kind of a check for your work. So if you think you've got the right answer and you think you know the necessary assumption, just negate the answer choice you think is correct and see if that actually breaks the argument. If it does and the conclusion cannot follow from the argument when you apply that negated assumption, you know that you have the right answer. But instead of doing this one method, there's a couple other tips I can give you to assist you in hopefully getting the answer without actually having to negate all the answer choices. The first thing I recommend is that you break out the argument into its support and conclusion, or the premises and the conclusion. So the first thing you want to do is identify the conclusion and identify each of the premises. From there, you're going to want to see if there's any gaps in the argument. So for example, are there any jumps in logic, or is there any shift in language? So if you notice a subtle shift in language, the necessary assumption will likely take into account that shift. So once you've figured out that gap or the shift in language, you can then hopefully pre-answer and choose the correct answer choice. So if your pre-answer doesn't work or you're unable to pre-answer the question, another thing that you might want to do when looking at the answer choices before negating is cross out any answers which are obviously irrelevant to the argument or any answers which are overly broad. Overly broad answers are words such as all, none, never, always. Those are not usually correct when dealing with a necessary assumption. In our future video on sufficient assumption questions, you're going to do the opposite and actually be looking for those overly broad statements, but with a necessary assumption question, those are not usually the correct answers. To clarify this and really hone in on what the thought process should be, let's do a sample necessary assumption question. I'll put the question somewhere up here. So we have a researcher basically saying that some cases of high blood pressure can be dealt with medicine, and since it's generally accepted that any illness that is caused by stress can only be treated by the reduction of stress, some cases of high blood pressure cannot be caused by stress. So this is hopefully a question that you can answer fairly quickly. Now I note that if we use the negation method and dealt with negating all 5 answer choices, it would take much longer than the time that you would be allotted per question. So let's follow this method and hopefully pre-answer the question, and we can use the negation method as a double check. So the conclusion in this case is some cases of high blood pressure must not be caused by stress. So the 2 pieces of support in this argument is that high blood pressure has been dealt with using medicine, or some cases of high blood pressure have been dealt with using medicine. And secondly, any cases that are caused by stress are only treatable by the reduction of stress. So as I said, now we've got our premises and conclusion. Are there any gaps in this? So we don't have any shifts in language in this question, but we do have a fairly sizable assumption being made. And that is that medicine that's being used to treat high blood pressure cannot or does not reduce stress. Because what that would mean is that if medicine reduced the stress, you could have a situation where the stress is the cause of the high blood pressure, the effect of the medicine is to reduce the stress, and therefore the high blood pressure goes away. So that would be the perfect pre-answer in this circumstance. If we look at the answer key, it's evident that E matches that pre-answer. But in case you didn't get that in your pre-answer, let's try the negation method to double check that answer. Remember, if we negate the right answer, it's going to break the conclusion when we apply the negated assumption to the argument. So if we negate E, that would mean that medicine used in high blood pressure situations reduces stress. Clearly then, the argument's conclusion cannot stand because the medicine may reduce the stress, which means that all cases of high blood pressure may in fact be caused by stress. We don't know. So as a result, E is the correct answer, both by using the gap method or the negation method. I hope this video was helpful. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much. Take care. See you next time.